Hello, my name is Ezanwa Ongbenu, and the topic of this discussion is going beyond Ebola hysteria. Now, I use the term hysteria because the nature of the international media coverage of the present Ebola outbreak in West Africa and also isolated cases in Europe and the United States has been every bit as hyperbolic as the disease in question is pathogenic. Now, not to discount Ebola because it's a highly lethal disease and highly infectious, and it is a global health challenge, but the media coverage has been questionable and, in my opinion, quite irresponsible. Now, in this talk, I would like to provide some context on Ebola virus disease, both on ways we can protect ourselves and also to allay some unnecessary fears. So, Ebola is a virus. So a good starting point would be a little background on viruses. So viruses are the most numerous biological entity that we have on the planet, and viruses have two key structural elements. They have an outer protein capsule, and this protein capsule defines the shape of viruses because viruses come in numerous shapes. They're spherical, some are rod-like, some are like worms, some are like helices, and several other forms. Some are even shaped like hypodermic needles, and so on. And in the interior of the virus is the genetic material. And this genetic material could be either DNA or RNA, depending on the type of virus. Now, viruses are really, really small. They are hundreds of times smaller than bacteria and thousands of times, or even tens of thousands of times, smaller than individual human cells. Now, viruses are not technically alive because they do not have a metabolism. They do not generate or consume energy. What viruses are self-replicating nanoparticles. And how they replicate themselves is that they hijack the metabolism of a living organism, be it a bacteria, be it a fungi, be it a plant or a human being, for example. So let's say this is a human cell with its nucleus and various other organelles that are in the interior, and outside we have, let's say, the Ebola virus. So the Ebola virus gains entry into the cell via attachment to some membrane-bound protein. And once it gains entry into the cell, it releases this genetic material. And that genetic material is the key because that genetic material contains the instructions on how to hijack a cell's machinery, how to convert a cell into a virus-making factory. So the cell now is no longer what it previously was. It's now essentially a virus-making factory. And it keeps on making more copies of Ebola virus, for example, until the cell eventually breaks apart and releases all those virus particles called virions. And those virus particles go on to attach onto other cells, gain entry, and reproduce that same process in an exponential fashion. And that's why viruses, despite their very, very, very tiny size, are able to create serious damage in much larger organisms because of the exponential nature of their proliferation and spread. Now, viruses are usually thought of as being bad or uniformly harmful to other life forms, but that is not the case. In various ecological systems, viruses are critical for the survival of higher life forms. And also in the human body, viruses are essential for our survival. So let me give you a little background on the relationship between man and viruses. Now, in the human body, they are estimated to be 10 trillion cells. 10 trillion human cells. And for every human cell, on average, we have 100 viruses. So in the human body are about 1 quadrillion viruses. Now, most of these viruses are enteroviruses or bacteriophages. That is, these are viruses that infect bacteria and not human cells. And these bacteriophages are a critical part of our immune system. That is, they help to protect the body against infectious organisms. So, for example, most of the bacteria in the human body are located within our intestines, and more specifically in our large intestine. So if we look at a cross-section of the large intestine here, in the interior of the large intestine there is a mucosal lining, and this interior space is referred to as the lumen, and inside this lumen is lots of bacteria, both good and bad. But the basic thing is that as long as the bacteria remain within this lumen, that is a desirable situation. What you don't want is these bacteria to cross out of the intestines into the circulation, because that will lead to sepsis and also other forms of organ damage. So, in this mucosal lining in the interior of the intestines are embedded numerous species of viruses. This is where a large number of these quadrillion viruses in the human body are located. They are embedded in mucosal linings, and these viruses target certain types of bacteria. So if a bacteria comes near this mucosal lining, it is infected by the virus and is destroyed. So these viruses are an essential aspect of preventing bacteria from getting into compartments that they're not supposed to get into. And we have these viruses embedded in several other mucosal linings in our bodies. For example, in our lungs or in our urinary tract. So they're a critical defense against other infectious organisms, such as harmful bacteria or pathogenic fungi and so on. And there are numerous other ways in which the interaction between man and viruses are quite profound, but that is beyond the scope of this talk. Now, specifically with Ebola virus or with any infectious challenge, be it bacterial, be it fungal, or be it viral, the critical determinant of your vulnerability is your immune status. And this fact is not mentioned enough in the mainstream media or anywhere really, because it's all about your immune status. Because despite the virulence or the infectiousness of any given pathogen, the key determinant is the inner terrain. So you can summarize this as follows: the pathogen is nothing, but the inner terrain is everything. And it is like this with any infectious challenge. Consider, for example, in the present Ebola outbreak, only half of people infected with Ebola virus develop symptoms. And then of those that develop symptoms, in this present outbreak, about 55% succumb to the virus. Now, we always hear the latter part of this statement, that is, 55% of people infected succumb, but we don't hear enough of the fact that only half of the people infected actually develop symptoms. So that half that do not develop any symptom, they are exposed to Ebola virus, and the virus proliferates in the body, but their immune system rises to the challenge and does not allow the virus to proliferate to a degree that it creates perceptible symptoms, such as body aches or fever, or in advanced stages, internal bleeding. So that is why host immune status is the critical determinant. Now, you can also see this principle at work in previous outbreaks of Ebola. Like, for example, in the 1997 outbreak of Ebola in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Ebola disease had a much higher mortality rate, about 95%. And the reason for that was because that outbreak occurred in the midst of a civil war. So within the country, Democratic Republic of Congo, there were many internally displaced people. And these people were severely malnourished, and they were under severe emotional stress. And these two factors compromised the immune system, diet and emotional state. And because of their weakened immune system, by virtue of the wider socio-political context, that is civil war, the Ebola virus was much more lethal in that context. So that's why in that instance, the Ebola virus had a much higher lethality than it does presently. So the key determinant, once again, is host immune status. So with that being said, that really tells us a very necessary intervention, both in a preventative way and also in terms of treatment, is that we have to support the immune system. And one of the simplest ways to support the immune system is by improving diet. And by improving diet, that just means reducing intake of highly processed foods, because these foods are not only poor nutrition for the body, but they also contain many harmful chemicals that compromise the immune system. So that is intake of more fruits, more vegetables, more whole foods, or a more ancestral diet before these newfangled, packaged and fancy foods came about. What we ate about a century ago, just home-cooked meals from whole foods, simple ingredients that are now translated into meals. That is how you rebuild the immune system, and that is the ultimate protection that you have against Ebola. Not any particular herb or any plant or any fancy vaccine or fancy drug, because your immune system is up to the task of dealing with any infectious challenge. But what it needs is just, it needs to be maintained in a very optimal or robust way, and an easy way to do that is through diet. Emotional states also matter a lot, like being under chronic emotional stress, but that is much more complex and is beyond the scope of this talk. So with that being said, Ebola virus is a hemorrhagic viral, it causes a hemorrhagic viral fever, and that is the defining characteristic of Ebola, because its other symptoms such as body aches or fevers or diarrhea or cough are very difficult to differentiate from, let's say, malaria or typhoid that are endemic in West Africa and other parts of the world as well. But the hemorrhagic phase, that refers to the rupturing of blood vessels. So the virus attacks the interior lining of blood vessels. So let's say this is an artery or an arteriole, that's a smaller artery, or even a capillary, that is a very small blood vessel. So it infects the delicate interior lining and causes it to rupture, and this leads to internal bleeding. And it's this internal bleeding that really creates a lot of organ damage, and if the disease process reaches this stage, there is a high probability that the infected individual is going to succumb to that infection. Typically, once you have internal bleeding, in the next 48 to 72 hours, that patient will likely die. Now, Ebola is one member of a family of viruses that cause hemorrhagic viral fevers, such as Lassa virus or Marburg virus, and also vesicular stomatis virus, and several others, and even those that are not yet known to science. Now, with that being said, hemorrhagic viral fevers have a lot in common with acute scurvy. That is an acute vitamin C deficiency, because the blood vessels in the human body, a key structural element is a protein called collagen. Collagen is what gives the blood vessels structural integrity, its robustness, its elasticity, its ability to withstand blood flow. Now, the synthesis of collagen in the body requires vitamin C. Without vitamin C, the body is not able to make sufficient collagen to build or maintain blood vessels. So, for example, individuals with acute scurvy have, for example, gum bleeding, and they are also at high risk of other forms of internal bleeding because their blood vessels are weak. Now, it's possible to have subclinical scurvy or a vitamin C deficiency that does not create palpable symptoms, and that makes you more vulnerable to hemorrhagic viral fevers. Because if you have a low-level vitamin C deficiency that you're not aware of, your blood vessels are going to be compromised. So when those blood vessels are challenged by a virus that attacks the delicate lining, that blood vessel is much more prone to rupture. So a critical preventative measure and also a treatment as well is to ensure adequate vitamin C status. And by vitamin C, I do not refer to synthetic vitamin C or ascorbic acid, because that in fact is not vitamin C. It's an antioxidant, but it is not vitamin C, because vitamin C is in fact a complex of which ascorbic acid is just one component. There are several other biomolecules that create vitamin C, the active form of vitamin C that actually is involved in collagen synthesis. So the solution is not to pop a vitamin C pill, rather increase intake of fruits and vegetables. And a very simple and effective way to ensure optimal vitamin C status is to drink lime water. You take a glass of water and you squeeze the juice of 2 limes, and that will ensure adequate intake of vitamin C. And there are several other beneficial compounds in lime water that will also assist in maintaining a robust immune system. So with that being said, all the emphasis from the medical establishment in relation to Ebola virus disease is either the quest for a vaccine or for some other pharmaceutical drug that is able to inhibit the virus. Now, this is fine and well, but the reality is that we have numerous natural alternatives as well that have been demonstrated in the scientific literature. So, for example, one was beta cola, and this was discovered by a Professor Maurice Wu, I believe in 1999, and they found that certain flavonoids in the beta cola are able to inhibit the Ebola virus. So, for example, how it works is that if this is the human cell and this is the virus particle, in this case Ebola virus, what these flavonoids do is that they prevent the virus from being able to attach and eventually gain entry into the cell. So in this way, the virus is not able to infect or spread or create any sort of damage. Because notice, you can't really kill a virus because it's technically not alive. It's just a nanoparticle. But what this phytonutrient, this flavonoid in beta cola does is that it inhibits the virus from gaining entry. Now, I want to go beyond beta cola and to really situate this argument in how beneficial and powerful botanicals, plants are as a whole. Because if you think about it, a plant might appear quite vulnerable because it's just situated in the soil and it's exposed to various pathogens, because there are numerous types of bacteria that would love to eat this plant, all sorts of fungi that would love to eat this plant, numerous sorts of viruses that would love to hijack its machinery and replicate within it. So a plant is constantly facing a barrage of microorganisms that seek to eat it or infect it. So how plants protect themselves is that they have numerous chemicals that serve as their immune system. They have numerous phytonutrients that inhibit viruses, that kill bacteria, that kill fungi. So when we consume certain plant foods and we digest it and it's circulated around the body, we adopt a fraction of the plant's immune system, because the plant immune system is chemical based. And that's why, for example, bitter kola is able to inhibit viruses, because that bitter kola needs those compounds to inhibit viruses, because if not, it would just be infected immediately, because nature is ruthless and does not take any prisoners. So, for example, many other plant foods have this property. In fact, to a degree, all plants, but of course not all of them are edible. But some of the most potent antimicrobial plants that we know are, for example, turmeric, ginger, citrus fruits like lime, garlic, and it goes on, because these plants contain thousands of compounds that are effective against numerous fungi, against numerous viruses, against all sorts of bacteria. And it's very important that we move beyond this conception of thinking of these plant foods as just only nutrition to the body. When we eat these plant foods, especially in a raw state, or if we just juice them and we don't expose them to high temperatures, those compounds in these plants, because these plants are composed of hundreds of thousands of unique biomolecules that serve various functions within these plants. But out of those hundreds of thousands, there are several hundreds, or even more than that, that are designed to serve as this plant's immune system. And when we consume those plants, for the duration that those molecules are circulated in the body in a bioactive form, we have adopted the plant's immune system. That is why these plants have been shown in the scientific literature time and time again to be potent against numerous bacteria, numerous viruses, numerous fungi, and numerous other infectious agents. And it behooves us to exploit this wealth, this vast library of antimicrobial, antiviral substances, and utilize them for the maintenance of our health. Now, I hope you found this talk useful. Thank you so much for your time.